हेलो दोस्तों, बिगनर्स पॉइंट में आपका स्वागत है। और अभी हम कर रहे हैं इकोनॉमी, जो है ट्वेल्थ ट्वेल्थ क्लास की मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक्स। ठीक है। इससे पहले की अगर आपने वीडियो नहीं देखी है तो प्लेलिस्ट बना रखी है, देख सकते हैं। द प्रोपोर्शनल इनकम टैक्स दस एक्ट्स हैज एन ऑटोमेटिक स्टेबलाइजर, अ शॉक absorber because it makes disposable income and thus consumer spending less sensitive to fluctuations in GDP. When GDP rises, disposable income also rise but by less than the rise in GDP because a part of it is siphoned off as tax. This helps limit the upward fluctuations in consumption spending during a recession. When GDP falls, disposable income falls less sharply and consumption does not drop as much as it otherwise would have fallen had the tax liability been fixed. This reduces the fall in aggregate demand and stabilizes the economy. We note that these physical policy instruments can be varied to offset the effects of undesirable shifts in investment demand. That is, if investment falls from I0 to I1, government spending can be raised from G0 to G1 so that autonomous expenditure C plus I0 plus G0 equals to C plus I1 plus G1 and equilibrium income remain the same. This deliberate action to stabilize the economy is often referred to as discretionary fiscal policy to distinguish it from the inherent automatic stabilizing properties of the fiscal system. As discussed earlier, proportional taxes help to stabilize the economy against upward and downward movements. Welfare transfers also help to stabilize income. During boom years, when employment is high, tax receipts collected to finance such expenditure increase, exerting a stabilizing pressure on high consumption spending. Conversely, during a slump, these welfare payments help sustain consumption. Further, even the private sector has built-in stabilizers. Corporations maintain their dividends in the face of a change in income in the short run, and households try to maintain their previous living standards. All these work as shock absorbers without the need for any decision maker to take action. That is, they work automatically. The built-in stabilizers, however, reduce only part of the fluctuation in the economy. The rest must be taken care of by deliberate policy initiatives. Transfers, we suppose that instead of raising government spending in goods and services, government increases transfer payments. TR, autonomous spending A dash will increase by C delta TR, so output will rise by less than the amount by which it increases. When government expenditure increases because a part of any increase in transfer payments is saved. Using the method used earlier for deriving the government expenditure multiplier and the taxation multiplier, the change in equilibrium income for a change in transfer is given by delta y equals to C divided by 1 minus C delta TR. Delta y divided by delta TR equals to C divided by 1 minus C. We suppose that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75 and we have lump sum taxes. The change in equilibrium income when government purchases increase by 20 is given by delta y 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75 delta g equals to 4 into 20.80. An increase in transfers of 20 will raise equilibrium income by delta y equals to 0.75 divided by 1 minus 0.75 delta tr. 3 into 2060. Thus, we find that income increased by less than it increased with a raise in government purchases. Debt. Budgetary deficits must be financed by either taxation, borrowing, or printing money. Governments have mostly relied on borrowing, giving rise to what is called government debt. The concepts of deficits and debt are closely related. Deficit, Deficits can be thought of as a flow which add to the stock of debt. If the government continues to borrow year after year, it leads to the accumulation of debt and the government has to pay more and more by way of interest. These interest payments themselves contribute to the to the debt. Perspectives on the appropriate amount of government debt. There are two interlinked aspects of the issue. One is whether government debt is a burden, and two, the issue of financing the debt. The burden of debt must be discussed keeping in mind that what is true of one small trader's debt may not be true for the government's debt, and one must deal with the whole differently from the part. Unlike any other any one trader, the government can raise resources through taxation and printing money. By borrowing, the government transfers the burden of reduced consumption on future generations. This is because it borrows by issuing bonds to the people living at present but may decide to pay off the bonds some 20 years later by raising taxes. These may be levied on the young population that have just entered the workforce, whose disposable income will go down and hence consumption. Thus, national savings, it was argued, would fall. Also, government borrowing from the people reduces the savings available to the private sector to the extent that this reduces capital formation and growth. Debt acts as a burden on future generations. Traditionally, it has been argued that when a government cuts taxes and runs a budget deficit, consumers respond to their after-tax income by spending more. It is possible that these people are short-sighted and do not understand the implications of budget deficits. They may not realize that at some point in the future, the government will have to raise taxes to pay off the debt and accumulated interest. Even if they comprehend this, they may expect the future taxes to fall not on them but on future generations. A counter-argument is that consumers are forward-looking and will base their spending not only on their current income but also on their expected future income. They will understand that borrowing today means higher taxes in the future. Further, the consumer will be concerned about future generations because they are the children and grandchildren of the present generation, and the family which is relevant decision making a unit continues living. They would increase savings now, which will fully offset the increased government saving so that national savings do not change. This view is called Ricardian equivalence after one of the greatest 19th century economists, David Ricardo, who first argued that in the face of high deficits people save more. It is called equivalence because it argues that taxation and borrowing are equivalent means of financing expenditure. When the government increases spending by borrowing today, which will be repaid by taxes in the future, it will have the same impact on the economy as an increase in government expenditure that is financed by a tax increase today. It has often been argued that debt does not matter because we owe it to ourselves. This is because although there is a transfer of resources between generations, purchasing power remains within the nations. However, any debt that is owed to foreigners involves a burden since we have to send goods abro- abroad corresponding to the interest payments. Other perspective on deficits and debt. One of the main criticism of deficits is that they are inflation- inflationary. This is because when government increases spending or cuts taxes, aggregate demand increases. Firms may not be able to produce higher quantities that are being demanded at the ongoing prices. Price will therefore have to rise. However, if there are unutilized resources, output is held back by lack of demand. A high fiscal deficit is accompanied by higher demand and greater output, and therefore need not be inflationary. It has been argued that there is a decrease in investment due to a reduction in the amount of savings available to the private sector. This is because if the government decides to borrow from private citizens by issuing bonds to finance its deficits, these bonds will compete with corporate bonds and other financial instruments for the available supply of funds. If some private savers decide to buy bonds, the funds remaining to be invested in private hands will be smaller. Thus, some private borrowers will get crowded out of the financial markets as the Government claims an increasing share of the economy's total savings. However, one must note that the economy's flow of savings is not really fixed unless we assume that income cannot be augmented. If government deficits succeed in their goal of raising production, there will be more income and therefore more savings. In this case, both government and industry can borrow more. Also, if the government invested in infrastructure, future generations may be better off, provided the return on such investments is greater than the rate of interest. The actual debt could be paid off by the growth in output. The debt should not then be considered burdensome. The growth in debt will have to be judged by the growth of the economy as a whole. Deficit reduction. Government deficit can be reduced by an increase in taxes or reduction in expenditure. In India, the government has been trying to increase tax revenue with greater reliance on direct taxes. Indirect taxes are regressive in nature, they impact all income groups equally. There has also been an attempt to raise receipts through the sale of share in PSUs. However, the major thrust has been towards reduction in government expenditure. This could be achieved through making government activities more efficient through the better planning of programs and better administration. A recent study by the Planning Commission has estimated that to transfer rupee 1 to the poor, government spends rupees 3.65 in the form of food subsidy, showing that cash transfers would lead to increase in welfare. The other way is to change the scope of the government by withdrawing from some of the areas where it operated before, cutting back government programs in vital areas like agriculture, education, health, poverty alleviation, etc., would adversely affect the economy. Governments in many countries run huge deficits, forcing them to eventually put in place self-imposed constraints of not increasing expenditure over predetermined levels. 5.2 gives main features of the FRBMA in India. These will have to be examined keeping in view the above factors. We must note that larger deficits do not always signify a more expansionary fiscal policy. The same fiscal measures can give rise to a large or a small deficit depending on the state of the economy. For example, if an economy experiences a recession and GDP falls, tax revenues fall because firms and households pay lower taxes when they earn less. This means that the deficit increases in a recession and falls in a boom, even with no change in fiscal policy. और इसी के साथ ये चैप्टर हो जाता है समाप्त. समरी और देख लेते हैं इसकी. पब्लिक गुड्स. Public goods, as distinct from private goods, are collectively consumed. Two important features of public goods are they are non-rivalrous in that one person can increase her satisfaction from the good without reducing that obtained by others, and they are not excludable, and there is no feasible way of excluding anyone from enjoying the benefits of the good. These make it difficult to collect fees or their use, and private enterprises will in general not provide these goods, hence they must be provided by their government. The three functions of allocation, redistribution and stabilization operate through the expenditure and receipts of the government. The budget, which gives a statement of the receipts and expenditure of the government, is divided into the revenue budget and capital budget to distinguish between current financial needs and investment in the country's capital stock. The growth of revenue deficit as a percentage of fiscal deficit points to a deterioration in the quality of government expenditure involving lower capital formation. Proportional taxes reduce the autonomous expenditure multiplier because taxes reduce the marginal propensity to consume out of income. Public debt is burdensome if it reduce future growth in output. ठीक है, और इसके साथ ये इकोनॉमी हो जाती है समाप्त.